Chapter 1. The Price of a Barren Womb. The torches in the great hall of Ashvale Keep had burned low by the time Lord Caelan Duskmore made his decision known. Ilara stood at the centre of the stone floor, her hands clasped before her, her chin lifted, not in pride, but in the desperate preservation of dignity. She had learned, in the 4 years of her marriage, that dignity was the only thing a woman might own, when everything else had been stripped from her. Around her, the Council of Ashvale sat in their carved oak chairs, grey-bearded men whose eyes moved over her as though she were a mare at market, inspected and found wanting. Her husband, Lord Caelan, stood apart from them near the hearth. He did not look at her. "The healer's assessment stands," said Elder Boric, his voice dry as winter bark. 4 years, no offspring, no signs of carrying. The bloodline of Duskmore requires continuation, and the lady cannot provide it. Elara's breath came slow and measured. She had practiced this. She had stood before her mirror in the cold of the morning and taught herself how not to shatter. "She is not without use," her husband said finally, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who has already made his peace with a thing. "The treaty with the northern border keeps calls for a tribute. Lord Governor Maron has debts that require settling. A woman of noble birth, even one as she is, carries value as a gesture of goodwill." Ilara heard the words as if from the bottom of a deep well. A tribute, a gesture of goodwill. She was to be traded, then, passed along the road like a parcel of grain, her worth measured not in who she was, but in what she had failed to become. "My lord husband." Her voice did not waver. She had promised herself it would not. "I would speak." Caelan turned his head. His eyes were not cruel. That was perhaps the most unbearable thing, that he looked at her with something nearer to grief than hatred, as though he, too, were the victim of her body's failing. "There is nothing left to say, Ilara. The decision is made." "Then let it be recorded," she said, "that I did not weep, and that I did not beg. No one wrote it down, but she meant it all the same. She was given 3 days, 3 days to gather what could fit into 2 travelling trunks, to say farewell to the serving woman who had braided her hair each morning for 4 years, to walk the gardens of Ashvale Keep for the last time, and press the memory of them into the deepest part of herself, where no one could take it from her. On the morning of the 4th day, they put her in a carriage and sent her north. She did not know, as the iron gates of Ashvale closed behind her, that the road north did not lead to ruin. It led to a king. Chapter 2. What the Borderlands Keep. The northern territories of the realm were not gentle country. Ilara pressed her face against the carriage window and watched the land change around her. The rolling meadows of the south giving way to dark pine forests, the roads narrowing and growing rough beneath the wheels, the sky overhead turning the color of cold pewter. It was a land that made no promises and issued no invitations. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, and dared the world to find fault with it. She rather admired it. Lord Governor Maron's estate sat at the crossroads of 3 contested territories, a squat and graceless building that had been built for function rather than beauty. The governor himself was a man of middle years who wore his authority the way some men wore ill-fitting coats, loudly and with overcompensation. He received Ilara in his receiving hall with the enthusiasm of a man who had just been presented with a piece of furniture. "Lady Duskmore," he looked her over, "you are younger than I expected." "I am 21, my lord, and the matter of your condition, it has been confirmed." She had decided, somewhere on the long road north, that she would not flinch at this any more. "The healers of Ashvale have said I am unlikely to bear children. Whether they are correct is between myself and the goddess. But yes, that is the assessment. Maren grunted. He had not offered her a chair. You'll be housed in the East Wing. You'll serve as a companion to my wife, who requires entertainment. You will not make demands. You will not cause trouble. And when opportunity presents itself, he paused, his eyes sliding away. You may yet prove useful in other negotiations. Other negotiations. She was currency then. Still, always. Of course, my lord, she said pleasantly, as though he had told her the schedule of mealtimes. The east wing was cold, and the mattress was thin, and the single window looked out over a stable yard rather than any view worth having. Elara sat on the edge of the bed in the gathering dark, her trunks unpacked, her hands folded in her lap, and permitted herself, privately, in the silence, to feel the full weight of what had been done to her. She was not broken. She was certain of this, but she was bruised in places that did not show, and she thought it was important to acknowledge the bruising before she could begin the work of carrying it without limping. She had been a good wife. She had been kind and capable, and had run Ashvale's household with skill. She had sat beside her husband at council dinners and known the names of every man at table, and the names of their wives and children. She had managed accounts and correspondence and the welfare of 100 servants. She had done everything that had been asked of her, except the one thing they could not forgive her for failing to do. In the morning she rose before the household, found the kitchen, and charmed the cook into giving her a cup of something hot and bitter that passed for tea in this country. Then she went outside and stood in the stable yard in the grey early light and breathed the cold air and told herself very firmly that she was not finished. She did not yet know what that meant, but she held on to it anyway. She had been at the governor's estate for 11 days when the riders came, and the banner they carried bore not the governor's crest, but the black wolf of the Alpha King. Untend, Chapter 3, The King Who Did Not Smile. The Alpha King came himself. That was what no one had expected. Word had come ahead of him. 3 days of frantic preparation, of servants scrubbing floors and hanging fresh linens, and the governor sweating through his formal coat. Alpha King Cadric Vaughan of the Northern Reach did not typically descend on border estates unannounced. That he had done so now, and with a company of 40 riders, suggested that whatever business had brought him was not the sort that could be settled by messenger. Elara watched from an upstairs window as the company rode through the gates. She had heard stories of him, as one heard stories of storms and winter, and other unavoidable forces of nature. He was said to be 30 years of age and unmarried, though not for lack of suitors. The daughters of every noble house in the realm had been presented to him at one time or another, and he had declined them all with a courtesy so absolute that it could not quite be called rudeness. He was said to rule with an iron hand that never quite closed into a fist. He was said to see things. That last part she had always assumed was embellishment. She revised her assumption when he rode through the gates and scanning the courtyard and the windows above it with a single sweeping glance, found her. It lasted only a moment, his gaze touching hers through the wavy glass of the window. But it was not the glance of a man looking at scenery. It was the glance of a man who had found what he was looking for, without quite knowing he had been searching. Elara stepped back from the window. Her heart was behaving strangely, and she did not have time for that. The evening meal was a formal affair, and Elara was placed at the far end of the table with the governor's wife and 2 other companions, women whose function was decorative and whose conversation was accordingly limited to matters of embroidery and weather. She ate her food and listened to the table's higher end with the careful attention of a woman who has learned that information is the only form of power available to those without any other kind. The king spoke little. When he did speak, the table listened. His voice was low and carried the particular authority of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. He spoke of the border disputes, of the trade routes that had been disrupted by the unrest in the eastern passes, of the obligations Lord Governor Meron had failed to honor for the third consecutive season. The governor sweated, agreed to everything, promised what he had no clear means of delivering. The king listened to all of it with an expression of polite patience and gave nothing away. After the meal, when the company had retired to their separate quarters and the household was settling into the quiet of a late night, Elara was sitting in the small library off the east wing. She had discovered it on her third day at the estate and had been quietly grateful for it ever since. When the door opened, she looked up. The Alpha King stood in the doorway, still in his traveling clothes, a candle in hand. He looked for a moment more like an ordinary man than any king had a right to. "My apologies," he said without sounding particularly apologetic. "I was told this room was unoccupied. It is, largely. I don't count for much in this household." The words came out before she could decide whether she meant to say them. She expected him to leave. Instead, he stepped inside and looked at the shelves. "What are you reading?" Elara glanced at the book in her lap. A history of the borderlands. 14 years out of date, but the land hasn't changed much, I imagine. It hasn't. He moved along the shelf with the ease of a man comfortable in libraries. "You are the woman Meron received from the south. Duskmore's wife. Former wife. Traded away, as I understand it, though the polite term was offered in treaty goodwill." The king turned to look at her. His eyes in the candlelight were the color of deep river water, grey-green and not quite readable. "And you speak of it so plainly. I find plain speaking wastes less of everyone's time, my Lord King. I have been bartered for my inability to produce children. It is not a secret. It is simply the truth of my situation, and I have decided to wear it as plainly as linen, rather than hide it under silk." A pause, and then, very quietly, he said, "What is your name?" "Elara of—" She caught herself. "Elara, formerly of Ashvale. Elara," he said, as if testing the weight of it. He did not say anything else that night. He chose a book from the shelf, nodded to her, and left. She sat for a long time afterward, the history of the borderlands open and unread in her lap. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself this with great conviction. She was still telling herself this 3 days later, when the king sent for her. Anne Bach, Chapter 4, An Audience and its Aftermath. The summons came through the governor's steward, delivered with the expression of a man who could not quite account for what he was doing. "His Majesty requests the company of Lady Elara in the East Garden. At noon." The governor's wife raised her eyebrows. The other companions exchanged glances. Elara set down her embroidery. She had been making a poor attempt at it to seem occupied, and said simply, "Thank you," and went to put on her better dress. The East Garden was the one part of the governor's estate that had been given any care. Someone, at some point, had planted roses along the stone wall and allowed them to grow wild, and in late autumn they were bare of flower, but still beautiful in the way that honest structures are beautiful, all cane and thorn and form, making no false promises of summer. The king was already there. He stood with his back to her, looking at the wall of rose canes, and did not turn when she approached. "You are not afraid of me," he said. "Should I be? Most people are. Most people have more to lose than I do, my Lord King. When a woman has already been discarded, the threat of royal displeasure loses some of its sharpest edge." He turned then and she was struck again by the way he looked at her, not as a lord examines a subject, not as a man examines a woman, but as a person examines another person they are genuinely trying to understand. I have spoken with Maron about the nature of your arrangement here. Ah, she kept her voice easy. And what did he say? Very little of substance. He implied that you were available for further rearrangement should circumstances demand it. The king's voice remained level, but something behind his eyes shifted. I found the phrasing objectionable. So did I, when I first understood it. But one adapts. Does one? She looked at him directly. What is it you want to know, my lord king? You might as well ask plainly. I have already told you I prefer it. The wind moved through the rose canes and made a dry, whispering sound. I want to know, he said finally, what you were before they reduced you to a liability to be disposed of. The question hit her somewhere she had carefully sealed up. She took a breath. I was the third daughter of a minor lord in the southern provinces, she said. I was educated because my father believed in education for its own sake rather than for its utility. I managed my father's household from the age of 15 when my mother died, and I managed it well. I married Lord Duskmore at 17. I ran his estate with efficiency and, I believe, some skill. I was well regarded by those who worked within the household. She stopped, steadied herself. I was a complete person, before the healer gave her assessment, and I became a problem to be solved. The king said nothing for a moment. Then, a complete person. Yes, that is what I thought. She didn't know what to do with that. No one had said anything like it to her in a very long time. They walked the garden for another hour. He asked her about books, about the southern provinces, about how she had learned to manage accounts. She answered. She asked him carefully about the border disputes, not intrusively, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who had been paying attention at dinner. He answered with more detail than she had expected, and without condescension, which she had not expected at all. When they parted at the garden gate, he paused. Maron has indicated you might be sent east within the month, to another settlement. I had heard as much. I intend to prevent that. She looked at him very carefully. Why? Because, he said, it would be a waste. He walked away before she could decide what she meant to say. That night, for the first time in months, Alara did not dream of locked gates and empty cradles. She dreamed of rose canes, bare and honest, holding their shape through the cold. And Chapter 5. The Business of Kings. She had understood, by the second week of the king's visit, that he was not merely there to dress down the governor about trade routes. He was looking for something. She pieced it together from small things. The conversation she overheard as she moved through the estate's corridors, the questions his advisers asked of the staff, the way the king himself seemed to be measuring the household against some standard visible only to him. He spoke twice more with Alara in those days, once by deliberate arrangement and once by apparent accident, in the library, and each time he asked questions that felt less like conversation and more like the careful construction of a portrait. On the 14th day of his visit, his chief adviser, a woman named Dame Soulweaver, whose grey braid and sharp eyes suggested she had seen considerably more than she would ever say, appeared at the door of Alara's east wing room. His Majesty wishes to speak with you. Formally, this time in the receiving room. Formally, Alara noted the word, smoothed her dress, and followed. The receiving room was arranged with the furniture pushed back and 2 chairs set facing each other across the cold fireplace, a configuration that spoke of negotiation rather than punishment. Dame Soulweaver took up a position near the window. The king sat in one of the chairs, He gestured to the other. Elara sat. "I will be direct with you," he said, "because you have told me you prefer it, and because I find I prefer it myself when speaking with someone who will actually hear what I am saying. Please, I am 30 years of age. I have ruled the Northern Reach for 9 years, since my father's death. I have been pressured, at regular intervals, to take a mate, a queen, in the old terms. I have declined every candidate presented to me, not from stubbornness, but from honest assessment. The candidates were chosen for bloodlines and political allegiances, and the appearance of suitability. None of them were chosen for," he paused, something flickering in his expression, "character." Elara was very still. "I am also aware," he continued, "that my advisers consider my standards unreasonable. They may be correct, but I have governed a fractious territory through 3 years of drought and 2 years of border conflict, and I have done it because I understand the people and the land. I cannot afford to govern my own house with less care than I govern my kingdom." "No," Elara said quietly, "I imagine you cannot. I have read Duskmore's account of it. I found his reasoning complete, logical, within his understanding of the world, and entirely wrong." "Wrong? The value of a woman cannot be measured only in what her body may or may not produce. This is not a radical thought. It is simply a thought that men in comfortable positions rarely bother to have, because they are never required to." He met her eyes steadily. "I am required to think clearly. I cannot afford sentiment, but I can afford logic. And the logic, when I apply it to what I have seen of you in these 2 weeks, is quite clear. My Lord King, I am asking you to consider a proposal, Elara, not as a command, as a question offered to a complete person who may answer as she chooses." The fire in the grate crackled. Dame Solane, by the window, was studying the sky outside with great interest. Elara folded her hands in her lap and looked at the king of the Northern Reach, who was watching her with those grey-green eyes that saw things, and she felt something she had nearly forgotten the shape of, the sense that she was being regarded and not merely viewed. "Ask," she said, and what he asked changed everything, not because it was the question she had dreamed of, but because it was the question she had never once thought to hope for. And Chapter 6. What Kings Offer and What Women Choose. "I am asking you to come to the Reach," the king said, "not as a servant, not as a political token. As my intended." The silence that followed was very long. Elara was aware of several things simultaneously: the way the firelight moved on the stone floor, the careful neutrality of Dame Solane's expression, the steadiness of the king's gaze, and the strange feeling of the ground shifting beneath her, not unpleasantly, the way ground sometimes shifts when it is settling into something more solid than it was before. "You cannot be serious," she said at last, because it seemed the most honest response available. "I have rarely been accused of levity. I am a woman who has been traded by her husband because she could not provide children. I have no political alliance to offer you. My family holds no strategic territory. I have no wealth of my own, and no standing in any court that might benefit you. And the matter of children, whatever the healers of Ashvale may or may not have understood, cannot be guaranteed. I know all of this. Then you must explain your reasoning to me, because I cannot find it." He leaned forward slightly. "The Northern Reach has survived 9 years under my rule, not because I made perfect decisions, but because I made informed ones. I gather information, I assess it honestly, and I act on what it actually tells me, rather than what I wish it to say." He paused. "What it tells me about you is this. You managed a household of 100 with skill and no recognition. You endured public humiliation without bitterness corroding your judgment. You arrived in a cold, indifferent place and found the library within 3 days. You speak of your situation plainly because you have decided that honesty is more useful than performance. You asked me about border disputes not to impress me, but because you were genuinely curious, and in every conversation we have had, you have thought before you spoke. Those are very small things. They are not. They are the things I have been looking for. In 9 years and more candidates than I care to count. Elara was quiet for a moment. Then, and the question of heirs? The Reach has not survived this long by depending on a single means of continuation. I have cousins. I have a council. There are other ways to secure succession if it comes to that. And, he said it carefully, the healers of one southern keep are not the final word of the goddess. You cannot promise me it will not be held against me. People will say things. People will say things regardless. That is the reliable constant of any court. A sound caught in her throat that was not quite a laugh. No, she agreed. That does not change. This king, who had ridden north with his 40 riders and found her in a library reading a history that was 14 years out of date, and had asked her name as though it mattered, and had walked with her in a bare-caned garden, asking about books, and speaking of waste. She thought of the iron gates of Ashvale closing behind her carriage. She thought of the thin mattress in the east wing, and Maron's assessing eyes, and the phrase, "other negotiations delivered without shame." She thought of standing before her own mirror in the cold of the morning and teaching herself not to shatter, and all the things she had been before someone decided her body's silence was her only relevant quality. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "I need you to understand something. I will not come to you as a grateful woman who has been rescued. I will come as a person who has made a decision. I will do so with my eyes open, and I will expect the same of you. That is exactly what I am asking for. I will manage your household as I managed Ashvale's, and I expect to be treated as capable of doing so. Agreed. If I disagree with you on a matter of substance, I will say so. I would be alarmed if you did not. And the question of what I am, what people will call me," she held his gaze. "I will not pretend to be something I am not, and I will not hide what has been done to me as though it is a shame I carry. It is not my shame." Something moved through his expression, quiet and warm and entirely sincere. "No," he said, "it never was." Elara breathed in, breathed out, let the ground beneath her settle. "Then yes," she said, "I will come to the Reach." She did not know, when she said it, that there were those who would move to undo the match before it could be made. Because a woman who had been discarded was one thing, but a woman who had been chosen by the Alpha King was quite another. Anjat. Chapter 7. The Opposition of Small Men. The letter from Lord Duskmore arrived 4 days into the preparations for Elara's departure. It was addressed to the king, written in the formal hand of a man who had employed a scribe for the occasion, and it expressed, with considerable elaborate courtesy, Caelan Duskmore's concern for the king's inadvertent misunderstanding of the situation, and his eagerness to clarify the nature of the lady's arrangement before any regrettable decisions were made in haste. The king read it, set it down, read it again. "He believes," Dame Solaine said, "that you are unaware the woman has a barrenness diagnosis. I am not unaware. He further implies that she has perhaps misrepresented herself. She represented herself with complete clarity." The king set the letter aside. "Send Lord Duskmore a reply. Formal, polite, to the point, and the point is that a woman is not a treaty good, that the arrangements made by Ashvale for the disposal of his former wife do not require his input now that she is no longer his wife. and that his correspondence on this matter has been noted. Soulweaver allowed a small, satisfied expression to cross her face. Noted in what sense? In the sense that I have a long memory and a wide reach, and Lord Duskmore's trade licenses for the Southern Passage come up for renewal in spring. Very good, my Lord King. When she was told of the letter, received the news with the same steady calm that she had received everything else. She was in the East Wing, folding her dresses into the trunks she had already packed once before, and she paused with a grey wool bodice in her hands and said, "He was never cruel. I want to be fair about that. He was simply small, in a way that I could not make him larger." Soulweaver, who had brought the news herself, studied her. "You do not hate him." "I find hate expensive," Elara said. "It costs energy I would rather spend on other things." The king said something similar once. He said resentment is debt carried at poor interest. He sounds like a man who has thought carefully about how to live. He has also... Soulweaver paused, choosing her words with the precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime in courts. He has not, in 9 years, looked at anyone the way he looks at you. I say this not to encourage foolishness, but because I think you are the sort of woman who makes better decisions with accurate information. Elara was quiet for a moment. How does he look at me? As though you are the answer to a question he has been carrying so long he had stopped expecting an answer. The grey wool bodice went into the trunk. Elara closed the lid and pressed her hand against it for a moment, feeling the solid reality of it under her palm. She thought of a carriage pulling away from a keep with iron gates. She thought of the North Road, and the cold, and the thin mattress, and Maron's assessing eyes. She thought of a library, and a garden, and a king who had asked her name as though it mattered. "Pack the history of the borderlands," she told the maid who had come to help. "The one in the library. I'll return it eventually, but I'd like to finish it." The maid blinked. "Shall I ask the governor's permission?" "I rather think," Elara said, with something that was beginning to feel like warmth behind her sternum, "that the governor will grant it." He did. There was one more obstacle between Elara and the road north. It came not from Duskmore, not from Maron, but from the very court she was riding toward. And it had a woman's face. Na. Chapter 8. The Court and its Claws. The Northern Reach's capital, Vaughanhall, was everything that Ashvale Keep was not, where Ashvale had been ancient and comfortable and a little soft around its edges. Vaughanhall was a city built on conviction, dark stone and tall windows, and the constant distant sound of wind coming down from the mountain passes. And a court that had learned, through generations of necessity, to be precise in all things, because the margin for error in the north was considerably thinner than it was in the south. Elara arrived in the second week of winter, with the first snow of the season light on the air, and she stood in the great courtyard of Vaughanhall and breathed the mountain wind, and felt something unexpected, that she recognized this place, not in the sense of having been here before, but in the sense that it matched some internal landscape she had carried without knowing what to call it. The court received her with varied degrees of enthusiasm. There were those who were genuinely curious, older members of the council who had watched 9 years of the king's careful refusals and were cautiously optimistic that something had finally moved him. There were those who were entirely indifferent, and there were those, a smaller and more concentrated group, clustered around Lady Isabeth Cray, who was the third daughter of the most powerful lord in the Western Territories, and who had been, by widespread understanding, the frontrunner in the long and now concluded competition for the king's hand, who looked at Elara with the particular attention of people assessing a threat. Lady Isabeth was beautiful in the manner of a well-made weapon, everything arranged to maximum effect. She approached Ilara in the great hall on the second evening, in full view of everyone, with a smile that had been constructed with care. "Lady Ilara, what a journey you must have had. The southern roads in autumn are dreadful, I am told. The roads were fine. I am a reasonable traveller, and such an unusual situation. Taken from a border estate, how romantic in its way. The king has always had a fondness for the unconventional." A pause, precisely weighted, though one does wonder whether the unconventional will prove practical in the long run. Ilara looked at her pleasantly. "One always wonders about practical matters. I find the best approach is to demonstrate practicality rather than discuss it. Shall we see, over time, how it goes?" Something shifted in Isabeth's eyes. The smile remained. "Of course. I'm sure you'll manage admirably." She moved away with the grace of someone accustomed to making exits. The king appeared at Ilara's elbow moments later, with the expression of a man who had watched the whole exchange. "Well handled," he said quietly. "She is not my enemy," Ilara said. "She is simply a person who wanted something and did not get it, and is managing that disappointment in the available ways. I have some experience with disappointment. I can afford to be patient with how others navigate it." The king looked at her for a moment. "You continue to surprise me. I hope I continue to do so for a very long time," she said, and was rewarded with something she had not yet seen on his face, a smile, genuine and unguarded, that changed the whole cast of his features. It was, she thought, an excellent face when it smiled. She decided not to say this, but she thought it several more times over the course of the evening. Erna. Chapter 9. What the Goddess Keeps. The betrothal was announced at the winter solstice feast, in the old tradition of the north, before the full court and the fire that burned in the great hearth of Varnhall's hall. Ilara stood beside the king in a dress the colour of deep water. The court seamstress had asked what she preferred, and she had said, quietly, the colour of the river in winter, and had been provided with exactly that, and listened to the king speak words that were at once formal and entirely sincere, and felt that strange settling of the ground beneath her again, more solid now, more certain. She spoke her own words clearly. She had written them herself and memorized them, and Dame Solane had approved them with the expression of a woman who had waited 9 years for this particular event and was not going to leave the wording to chance. The court applauded. Lady Isabeth applauded with everyone else, and her smile, by the evening's end, had become something a little more real, the smile of a woman who had decided, perhaps, that acceptance was less costly than the alternative. Ilara, watching her, found herself hoping that she would be all right. She had enough experience with the peculiar devastation of not getting what you had wanted most to extend that wish to someone she might once have thought of as an adversary. Later, after the feast had wound down and the candles were burning low, she and the king stood together on one of Varnhall's high walkways, looking out over the city and the dark shapes of the mountains beyond. And the snow fell quiet and steady around them, like a benediction. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She considered this honestly. Of some things, the court is new, and courts have their own laws that take time to learn. "I don't know yet what I don't know, and that is always the most dangerous territory." She paused, "but not afraid in the way I was, the morning they put me in the carriage at Ashvale. That was the fear of a person who could see no ground in front of her. This is different." "Different how? I can see the ground. Even where it's uncertain, I can see it." She turned to look at him, snow catching in her hair and on the shoulders of her winter dress. "And I am not walking on it alone. He looked at her in the way Dame Solane had described, as though she were the answer to a long-carried question, and she found that she could look back at him without flinching, without performance, without the careful armor of a woman who has learned to protect herself with plainness. She could look at him simply as herself. "There is something I should tell you," he said, "about why I came to Marin's estate in the first place." She waited. "I had received reports, nothing specific, simply impressions from traders passing through, of a woman at the border estate who ran the herb garden the kitchen hadn't managed in years, who had reorganized the household accounts without being asked, who ate breakfast in the stable yard before anyone else was awake, and looked, according to one trader's memorable description, like someone who had decided not to be defeated." He paused. "I wanted to see for myself." Elara stared at him. "You came because of a trader's report. I came because the description interested me." Something almost rueful crossed his face. "I did not expect to find what I found." "What did you find?" Quietly, everything. She breathed in the cold mountain air, snow on her lips, snow in her hair. The city of Vaughanhall spread below them like a map of something real and enduring, and beside her, a king who had come looking for an impression and found a person and had been honest enough to know the difference. "I have a question," she said. "Ask. The healer's assessment. The one from Ashvale." She looked at him steadily. "Does it matter to you? Truly, whatever the answer turns out to be?" She had noticed, in all the time she had known him, that he did not rush answers that deserved thought. "What matters to me," he said, "is that you are here, that you are well, that you are not being traded or assessed or reduced to a single function that you may or may not be able to perform." A pause. "What matters to me is you, Elara, whole, as you are." She had not cried through any of it, not when Kaelan had stood by the fireplace and looked at her with grief in his eyes, not when the carriage had pulled away from Ashvale's iron gates, not when Marin had assessed her with his inventory glance, not through the cold of the East Wing room, or the long road north, or the weight of everything she had carried without anyone to help her carry it. She did not cry now either, but something released in her, something she had held so tightly for so long that she had forgotten it was a holding and not simply the shape of herself, and she felt it go, quietly, into the winter air. "I am here," she said, "whole, as I am." "Yes," he said, "you are." First, she returned the history of the borderlands to Marin's estate 3 months later, with a letter of thanks and a small parcel of northern herbs from the kitchen garden she had already begun to reorganize. The governor's steward wrote back to say that the governor was well and the new trade arrangements were proceeding satisfactorily. She heard nothing more from Ashvale, nor did she seek to. The court of Vaughanhall learned, in time, that the queen-to-be had opinions on household management, and a habit of appearing in the kitchen at breakfast, and a way of speaking to council members that was courteous and direct in equal measure, and that left people feeling, somehow, that they had been genuinely heard. This was unusual enough in a court setting that it became, within a season, simply a feature of the place, the way the mountain wind was a feature, constant and clarifying. Lady Isabeth took a position as head of the court's charitable concerns, a role she filled with surprising dedication. She and Elara were never close, but they were respectful, and occasionally, when they found themselves discussing the management of the relief stores for the winter settlements, something almost warm passed between them. The acknowledgement of two capable women operating in a world that had not always made space for capable women. As for the matter of heirs, which the court discussed at intervals with varying degrees of tact, the goddess, it appeared, had her own schedule and her own opinions. But that is another story, and it is Elara's to tell or not, as she chooses. What is certain is this: she was not finished the morning she climbed into the carriage at Ashvale and promised herself she would not shatter. She had been right about that, stubbornly, unfashionably, correctly right. She had been traded like a coin passed from hand to hand, each hand finding her wanting, until she reached the hand of a man who had gone looking not for a coin, but for a person, and had found one and had the uncommon wisdom to know what that was worth. And she, who had once stood in a stone hall and said, "I did not weep, and I did not beg," stood instead now on a high walkway above a northern city, with snow in her hair and a king at her side who asked her things as though her answers mattered, and felt the remarkable, ordinary, previously unimaginable sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She was not the woman they had discarded. She was the woman she had always been, finally standing somewhere large enough to contain her.